My friend Ashraf says. The summer vacation has ended, and we returned to school. One day, I was searching in my late grandfather's library for the book Safwat al-Tafasir by the author Sheikh Mamdouh Ali al-Sabuni. While I was engrossed in searching for the book, I noticed an old, worn-out book among the others titled Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra. I stumbled over the title of the book several times as I tried to grasp its content. Finally, I mustered up the courage to open it. My late grandfather was an imam of a mosque and a devout man, so I assumed it was a religious book. As I flipped through its pages randomly, what initially caught my attention was the strange and complex language of the book, as well as the abundance of symbols it contained and the presence of small notes between the pages written in an elegant handwriting, certainly not my grandfather's. Then I realized that those writings were nothing but explanations of the symbols and the mysterious meanings of the book. Curiosity overwhelmed me to search more about the content of the book on the internet, and I wish I hadn't. I was shocked by the search results, and it became apparent to me that the book is one of the most dangerous Arabic books ever written about summoning and harnessing jinn and demons and practicing sorcery in general. I spent the whole day and part of the night searching and digging and watching videos talking about the subject and different testimonies of people who spoke about relatives who died because of the book. I concluded that the book is religiously prohibited and dangerous because it contains topics that even the most experienced sorcerers couldn't comprehend. Among the information that caught my attention was that there are only 4 original copies of the book remaining, written on the skins of mythical animals, and that some paragraphs of it were written in blood because the ink couldn't record them due to their extreme brutality. Also, the printed copies in the public library in Beirut are nothing but replicas filled with errors and distortions. However, the only thing I couldn't figure out is why such a book exists in my grandfather's library. After returning home, I started asking my mother general questions about my grandfather's books, and what I understood from her is that there was a great dispute over those books due to their historical value, and the Ministry of Culture tried everything to obtain them to the extent that the state offered the family a large sum in exchange for those books, but they refused each time, considering them as a family heritage. Days and weeks passed, and an invisible inner struggle tormented me. Should I read the book or ignore it, especially after knowing its prohibition and that merely reading it is considered associating partners with Allah? However, my evil inclination tempted me to read it finally under the pretext of educating myself and gaining knowledge, and I downplayed the horror of what I was about to face by claiming that I would do nothing but read and that whatever I would do is much better than what others commit, such as drinking alcohol and committing adultery, and that reading alone would not harm me. My decision coincided with the first day of the university holiday. I closed my door and opened the first page, and the first word my eyes fell upon was burning, surrounded by circles in pencil, and I started reading the introduction of the book and repeated it 3 times without understanding anything except for a few simple words due to the complexity of its language. Then I remembered those concealed papers amidst the pages of the book, so I pulled them out, and the smell of camphor emanated from them, and they were written in pencil, and the handwriting was beautiful and neat that I often dispensed with reading the book and immersed myself in reading those explanations. And so, I spent 15 days reading that book without stopping. I used to stay up all night reading the book, and during the day, I would sleep, and I would tell my family that I was staying up to study for exams and prepare for exams. There were topics that I couldn't continue reading due to their danger, such as how to kill a human being through sorcery and how to control tribes of jinn, and other topics that involved associating partners with Allah that I can't speak about here. What surprised me most about this book was its inclusion of Quranic verses and sometimes detailed explanations of the beautiful names of Allah, then suddenly its subject matter would directly turn to disbelief and atheism, God forbid. After I finished the book, I felt that I had become educated in a field that few people truly understand, so I returned it to its place and thanked Allah that nothing happened to me, and I was sure that those warnings and repeated alerts from the book were nothing but delusions and nonsense, and how wrong I was. After a few days, I began to feel strange things happening to me. I became averse to being around others and speaking to them except for necessities, and sometimes I found myself unable to determine the times of day. For example, I would think it was 8 in the morning when it was actually 4 in the afternoon. I thought initially that it was just a psychological effect, but the situation worsened over time until one day I woke up to find both my hands stained with brown. Terror engulfed me, and I hurried to the bathroom. I washed my hands several times, but the color didn't disappear despite all attempts, so I went to my mother and showed her my hands. She was terrified like me and started reading whatever she could from the Quran. Then she immediately contacted one of the sheiks who asked me some strange questions such as whether I dream a lot, and whether strange things happen to me in the bathroom. I answered him without even hinting at the subject of the book, so he finally told me that what was in my hands was henna, and that last night was my wedding night with a genie. I screamed in terror, a genie? I had never hidden in my life in this way. In fact, the sheik reassured me and told me that he would annul this marriage, and he came to our house later and put a handful of salt in my hands and began to recite verses from the Quran. And it was only moments before I saw the sheik standing stunned and then rushed out of the house. I tried to catch up with him calling him, but he didn't turn to me for a moment. I returned to my room regretfully, and despair and fear engulfed me from all sides. But I didn't want to exacerbate my mother's worries, and with the sense of humor that I always enjoyed, I greeted her with a tired smile and jokingly told her that we had finally become rich. How not when Shemarash has become our son-in-law? But I won't forget my mother's expressions, who didn't move her lips at all, unlike her usual, as she looked at me with the look of someone attending a funeral. I rushed to embrace her and tried to reassure her, promising her that everything would be fine, but deep down, I felt her suffering with me, especially since she hadn't stopped reading the Quran day and night while watching me torture myself because of my inability to know the times, and even the years, so sometimes I felt that we were in the year 2011 while we were in 2016, and the worst suffering I experienced was when it was time to sleep and I would fall asleep and put several cotton towels beside me just in case. And one of those nights, I woke up at 3 in the morning terrified, and after washing, I left the house wandering aimlessly on my face, and because I was wearing a jacket and a baseball cap that obscured the details of my face, the security guard thought I was one of the rogue thieves, so he pulled out a stick from under his desk and rushed towards me, and I couldn't utter a word until he fell on his face and rolled on the ground as if something invisible obstructed his path and was widening it with blows. I fled from the place back home, and the next day, the neighborhood residents circulated that an unknown car hit the guard and fled to an unknown destination, and to this day, I haven't spoken a word, and it seems that the guard has forgotten everything about that incident. And only on that night did I realize that I had indeed married a genie and that the curse of the book had affected me. I stopped going to college, and nightmares started haunting me. Nosebleeds became frequent, and the ground seemed to shrink beneath me, suffocating me in its narrowness after my days turned into sessions of relentless torment. Then came a Thursday when I harbored a decisive resolution, especially after reading in a book beforehand that on Thursdays, the horn of the devil meets with faith, and its evil surfaces. I said to myself, I have nothing left to lose, so I'll try something. Perhaps it will save me. I turned to the book and moved to the section about fulfilling wishes. I found many methods, but I only understood one well-explained method involving a table with several symbols. I spent about half an hour transferring those symbols and filling the 39 squares with the names of Allah and many other things. I won't tell you it so you won't try it. When I finished, I made a wish. Then I brought a knife and placed it beside me. I lay down on my bed and pondered whether all this would work or if I was only making matters worse. I didn't blink that night, consumed by panic. I got up, turned on the lights, and sat in the middle of the bed, waiting for morning to come. But I returned to my bed again, lying down, trying to distract myself with any thought. Suddenly, the lights went out, and I'll not hide it from you secretly. My hair stood on end from the intensity of my panic. I froze in place like a statue, unable to even blink my eyelashes. I tried secretly to recall some Quranic verses, but fear had paralyzed my mind. When the silence prolonged and nothing happened, I jumped up, running towards the light switch and turned it on. Then I squatted in one corner of the room, praying incessantly until morning dawned. I dressed, and the clock showed 6 in the morning. I decided to head straight to the college. Since it was located in the outskirts of the city, I thought of sitting for a while in the nearby forest to escape from the horror of the previous night. So, I hailed a taxi, and upon arrival, the place was completely deserted, and the cold was biting. I headed to one of the wooden benches by the road and sat. Then I put on my earphones and started listening to songs. Suddenly, I heard the voice of a little girl. I removed the earphones and looked around, but found nothing. It wasn't a voice in the music. I put the earphones back on, and then I heard the voice of a girl calling my name, Ashraf. I stood there, terrified, looking around in every direction. When I returned to the bench, something suddenly grabbed me tightly, and I jumped from my place as if stung, screaming hysterically. Then blood started dripping from my nose, and I didn't know whether to wipe it or to check what was happening around me. After a moment, I heard the same voice, this time clearly in my ear. I almost had a heart attack, and the voice continued, saying, "You heard me, and you almost died. What if you saw me?" I wanted to scream, but my vocal cords failed me this time, and tears began to flow, repeating to myself while crying, seeking refuge in Allah from the accursed Satan. I started reciting the verse of the throne, Ayat al-Kursi, crying until I reached the part, "His throne extends over the heavens and the earth," and I heard the voice completing the verse to its end, then laughing, saying, "Do you want me to continue reciting Surah al-Baqarah until its end? I'm a Muslim just like you." As soon as I heard that, I fainted. When I woke up, the voice was still talking in my ear. I didn't understand anything and began to read the Quran aloud, and the voice in my ear echoed with me. When I stumbled in my reading, I stopped and started talking to myself, "Ashraf, this is just an illusion. Be a man and stop crying." But the voice said, "Look at the truck. There's a truck passing by." I turned to the truck and then ran towards it. I wanted to throw myself in front of it, but it suddenly flipped over, although its speed didn't exceed 20 kilometers per hour. It flipped onto its side, and at that moment, I wished that the angel of death would take my soul to relieve me from all this agony. I rushed towards the truck, terrified more than its driver, and people quickly gathered around it, and the car stopped. The driver got out, but no harm had befallen him. I was amidst the crowd, not out of curiosity to know what happened, but out of fear of being alone. The driver started telling people what happened, pointing at me, saying, "This young man saw everything with his own eyes." I was the only witness to the incident, but out of extreme fear, I denied seeing anything. At that moment, I didn't know whether to leave or stay in my place, until my feet led me back to the same bench without me realizing it. I tried to muster courage this time, and my inner voice said, what worse could happen than what already happened? There's nothing worse than death, and I wished for it without obtaining it. I bore witness to the two testimonies and began to think about what I should say to be able to hear the voice again. But I suddenly heard it saying, did you believe, or do you need more evidence? I didn't utter a word, so I remained silent. Then I resolved to speak, and my voice came out trembling, frightened, as I asked, what do you want from me? The voice replied, don't be afraid. As long as you sought me, I won't harm you. I am called Bahika. Before the voice finished speaking, I shouted, I didn't ask for anything. Leave me alone and mind your own business. I felt a strong slap on my face, one I had never received in my life. I fell silent as if someone had drugged me. I lowered my head, listening to the voice. It answered all my thoughts and questions within the limits it desired, without me even asking sometimes. It explained to me that if I didn't live in a fortified house, I later knew that my grandfather, may he rest in peace, had fortified the house in his life so that no harm could enter. I would be dead by now, and everyone who knew me or didn't commit suicide because of their insanity. My biggest mistake was that I used to read aloud everything I didn't understand, and the book contained talismans and invocations. Just moving the lips while reciting them could summon and subjugate the offspring of her kind. And what I suffer in my daily life after reading the book is only threats and minor annoyances because the demon that was summoned finds it difficult to enter our fortified house. It was only here that I realized the extent of the disaster I had gotten myself into. And she told me that when I was reading the book and reached a chapter about mating and copulating with the jinn, there were detailed explanations about it in the paper, and I kept reading aloud, whispering and silently, until I understood everything in that chapter. Coincidentally, Bahika was nearby, so she was chosen. And because marrying a human is desirable for jinn, she didn't believe the news and entered the house easily because she's Muslim. Bahika would answer my thoughts before I even asked them. Until I reached a point where I lost my fears somehow, and I started forgetting my fears and asked to see her, but she refused, telling me that the jinn have the ability to shapeshift 40 times, and she's still young and needs her chances over time. I asked her about her age, and I was shocked when she told me that she was 240 years old. She told me that she was from a tribe famous for their beauty and that they resembled humans in their appearances. When we marry, I will be able to see her. I began to feel somewhat relieved by that voice, despite the madness of the situation, and I started to forget my fears. I asked her if she would come to me whenever I wanted, so I heard the voice laughing and telling me that she was poor and Muslim, and she couldn't engage in the forbidden acts that the subjugated or collaborating jinn do with sorcerers. And there are things in our world that may seem simple but are valuable in their world and constitute wealth. The jinn cooperate with sorcerers and fulfill their requests for information and harm to humans in exchange for sacrifices and gifts, mostly consisting of black roosters or incense. I asked her many things, but most of my questions remained unanswered, especially the unseen things because, as she told me, she's a Muslim, and only Allah knows the unseen. My last question was whether the jinn live only in Morocco. She said, "How curious you humans are." In summary, what she told me was that the jinn were subjugated to serve her master, Solomon, along with the winds and animals. There was the largest prison for her people in the Atlas Mountains, and the jinn are fiery creatures. Solomon couldn't execute them, so he exiled them to that prison. Whenever a jinn was exiled there, his relatives committed sins until they all gathered there, making Morocco their largest habitat at that time. The whole world is full of them, and every human culture has different names for them: ghosts, extraterrestrial beings, spirits. Before I left the place, she informed me that she saw what I did last night in writing those symbols and wishes, and she was compelled to address me to warn me that by doing so, I had summoned the worst of demons and made an agreement with him to fulfill his requests and mine in return. He would appear to me in the form of a black cat, and he would demand that I whisper my requests in his ear, and he would then appear to me alone. So, I thought to myself to ask him to rid me of all these miseries that I had fallen into because of the book. But she heard my thoughts and told me that he would demand impurities from me. So, I asked her to clarify, and she replied that he would ask me to do things like drink menstrual blood or commit sins against my mother, for God's sake. Bahika's final words were that she couldn't help me with anything and that her family was preparing to take my soul away from me. Much of what she said was unclear, and every time I asked to see her, she refused. I returned home, and fear did not leave me for a moment. Did I go crazy? Is all of this a dream? How will I explain to others what happened to me? I entered the house to find my mother angry, and she asked me, "Where have you been? I called you several times." Then I found some people in the house who had come from the city of Tarudant with my father. I greeted them, and one of them began to speak. "Is this the one? Why did you shave your head like this, my son?" This man was the youngest of them and did not appear to be old. There were 4 people, all sitting and looking at my father, who showed no interest. Then he got up and left when he sensed their unease. I sat next to them and called my mother, and we began to explain to them the symptoms that had afflicted me, not telling them anything about what had happened to me that morning, of course, and even hiding everything from my mother. In the end, my mother asked me to bring the book so they could have a look at it, and when they heard the book, they all exclaimed in unison, "What book?" I replied, "The Great Son of Knowledge." Their faces turned pale, and one of them stood up in terror and screamed at the others, "Let's leave." And he addressed me, saying, "Have you gone mad, young man, or are you ill?" Then he asked me if I had read it at home, and soon there was a lot of chatter and noise among them, and my mother was scared and pleaded with them to help me. But they were all afraid and couldn't approach the book that I brought except for the youngest among them. He took the book and started flipping through its pages without any fear. I saw joy on his face, and his friends and the sheik told him to leave it, but he ignored them, as if he were a little child who had just gotten his favorite candy. My mother and I continued to talk to one of them, named Sheikh Mo, who lived in the outskirts of Tarudant and was famous, according to my mother, for his righteousness and his ability to heal such cases by the grace of God Almighty. The other 2 remained silent the whole time and couldn't stop staring at. Sheikh Mo explained to me how I had fallen into polytheism by reading that book and that there was no sheik in the world who could help me, and trying to do so could harm him because of the disasters that the book had unleashed. And so I became a danger to everyone, to myself, my family, and anyone who tried to help me religiously. The words of the sheik did not surprise me, and we talked a lot about all related matters. Then I confessed everything to him, and he told me that the jinn who married me would never leave me because I am from the lineage of Solomon. His origins trace back to our master Solomon, and this is considered a pride for the jinn, and it is impossible for a spouse like me to be lost from her hands. And if a female jinn marries a human, she cannot leave him except by his death, and she does not have the ability to marry again after him. At this point, I no longer paid much attention to the words of the sheik because all my attention was focused on that man who had not stopped flipping through the pages of the book. I did not feel comfortable with him from the first moment. His eyes were blue, emitting negative energy, and he spoke provocatively, especially when he told me that it was necessary for him to take the book because only through it could he treat me. But I realized his lie and exchanged lies with him, telling him that a goat appeared to me in my sleep and warned me that if the book fell into someone else's hands, it would take his soul. Our companion was afraid and sought refuge in God. Then he took out his mobile phone and tried to secretly take pictures of some pages from his companions, and Shikma was talking to my mother. I watched all this and wondered what sin I had committed in my life to deserve this. Am I not a human who can make mistakes and have the right to repent? How did my situation change? I, who used to laugh at anyone who talked about the jinn, now became the laughingstock. And the biggest problem was how to succeed in my studies when my greatest wish now is to maintain my sanity. Shikma sat me down next to him and tried to calm me down, saying that there was only one way out of all this, and if I were destined to live, I would never lead a normal life like other people ever again. Nevertheless, no matter what terrible things happen to me, I should be patient and bear the consequences of my mistakes like a mature man. We talked a lot and discussed many topics, and Sheikh Mohamed told me about people who entered the world of magic out of curiosity and ended up blinded by greed until they found themselves engulfed in oceans of troubles. Sheikh Mohamed amazed me with his high level of culture despite his Bedouin appearance and the simple education he received. We talked about contemporary social systems and advanced civilizations that strive to obscure the world of the supernatural and portray it to people as mere myths, even though modern science and technological progress have failed to explain many phenomena, all for the sake of gaining blind trust and obedience to human systems only. I benefited a lot from the words of that sheikh in that evening, which ended with a single conclusion, stating that the solution for me is to get help from a real sorcerer who knows no divine mercy and can find a way to the hearts of those creatures, convincing them that what I did was just an unintentional mistake, even though these creatures are like a train that, once it leaves the station, does not return. That's what Sheikh Mohamed said. That despicable man left the book after he finished photographing what he wanted, and he engaged forcefully in the discussion with us, telling me that he knows someone who studied many books of magic and might be familiar with the book Shams al-Ma'arif and is the only one capable of helping me. He said he would go to him in the city of Kmisat and bring him for this purpose. Then he took our phone numbers and said he would call us soon. We had dinner together that night, recited what we could from the Quran. Then they left the house after making many prayers for me without approaching or touching me. Sheikh Mohamed escorted me to the door and asked me to be patient and endure these days, not to go out of the house much until they find a satisfactory solution to my problem. He told me that from the moment they decide to confront those creatures, they themselves will work on taking revenge on me and my family, especially. They took 2,500 dirhams from me that night, including the expenses for transporting that person from Kmisat. I was struck by severe hunger that day, even though it hadn't been long since I had dinner, so I ate and then went to sleep without changing my clothes because I was very exhausted after 2 days of continuous insomnia and consecutive events. I woke up at 9 in the morning and felt a strange urge to bite anything I came across, so I took out a box of gum from the table drawer and put it all in my mouth, chewing it vigorously until I hurt my tongue, and when I felt the warmth of blood in my mouth, I remembered that I hadn't had nosebleeds that day. Strange. So I got up to tell my mother when suddenly the phone rang. Who could be calling at this hour in the morning? I answered. Hello. It's our youngest group member. Then I knew his name was Yusuf. He kept asking about my condition. Then he told me that he talked to that man from Kmisat and they will both come next Thursday. I welcomed the idea. and before I finished the call, he told me he wanted something important. I asked him what. He asked me to go to the book in such and such chapter and page and recite to him what's in it. I couldn't approach that book again, so I told him that my father traveled and took the book with him. And as soon as I said that, he hung up without saying goodbye. I told my mother about it and sat at my computer, but curiosity overwhelmed me about Yusuf's request, but soon fear and awe prevented me from approaching that book again. I was apprehensive about hearing Bahia's voice again, but nothing happened that morning and I spent the rest of the day relaxed, even though boredom was consuming me and the strong desire to go out of the house was surrounding me. But I firmly suppressed that desire and spent the day looking out of the window like any young child forbidden by his mother to go out. There's no beach in front of our house, nor a square. There's only a ruined area where all kinds of crimes are committed. I kept watching the neighborhood kids smoking hashish rolls, and some of them using cheap drugs like babila. I wondered why I was the only one who was not tempted by these things in the neighborhood, and how all my childhood friends wasted their lives between prisons and addiction, and I rewound the tape of memories from my birth until the day I obtained my baccalaureate certificate, and how the women of the neighborhood rejoiced at my achievement and lifted me on their shoulders, cheering as if I had found the elixir of life. And how the joy shone from my mother's face, for why wouldn't it? Her son was the first one to obtain a baccalaureate certificate in the neighborhood. My mother is the one who knew how to raise me and paid the price for it with her joy and happiness, and she still does. I returned to the living room, and my soul told me to call Bahia, but I tried to resist this urge, but soon I gave in and started shouting Bahia. Bahia. As I looked around, then I thought of shouting louder hoping she would hear me, and I started repeating Bahia. Bahia. Don't pronounce this name aloud. Then I heard, "What's wrong with you, boy? Have you gone crazy?" A tremor of horror ran through my body, and I turned around, but it was my mother's voice in the kitchen, mocking me, and beside her was my sister whom we hadn't told anything, so my despicable sister addressed my mother. Maybe he has started taking some of those poisons. I didn't pay attention to her words and went to my room and spent the rest of the day in front of my computer screen without eating anything, but I was drinking more water. I slept peacefully that night and woke up in the morning refreshed. My chest expanded and I said to myself, maybe I'm cured of what I was suffering from. So I had breakfast with my mother and told her that I was determined to go out after being overwhelmed by boredom, but she didn't allow it and tried to stop me, and we began to quarrel. I was determined to go out despite that, so I dressed and went to the cafe and sat with one of my friends. We chatted, and I had never told anyone about what happened to me before, but I thought of telling my friend a little about my suffering since he's my friend anyway, and maybe he could help me. So, I told him that I have nosebleeds almost every day at around 3 a.m. and I see strange things in my dreams. But damn, he started laughing mockingly at me and said that only fools and little children believe what I'm talking about. He advised me to go to the doctor because he's the one capable of knowing the problem and the treatment. I quickly changed the subject, and since he had recently obtained his driver's license and was still excited about it, he suggested that we take a ride outside the city in his father's car so he could practice driving more, and at the same time, we could have some fun. I agreed without hesitation, and we set off in the car. I returned home late, and when I opened the door, I found my mother waiting for me in a difficult condition. Then she started bombarding me with questions. Why are you panting? Where were you delayed? I tried to reassure her that nothing happened and that I was in a hurry, then hurried to my room and took off my cap to find long strands of hair inside it. It's a girl's hair. What's happening again? I quickly took a shower and returned to the room, turned on the room lamp, and it burned out. Where would I get a new lamp at this hour? I decided to sleep in the darkness and leave the room door open. I opened my eyes at 3 a.m. as usual, but not because of the nosebleed this time, but to find myself standing in the middle of the room with my hands folded. I returned to bed and lay down, then shivered. I opened my eyes to look at the ceiling and found fog obscuring everything. I stood up to turn on the lamp and remembered that it was burnt out. I found the room door locked. Strange. I wanted to open it but couldn't. I started shouting for my mother as I pounded on the door, but no one listened. I went back to search for the key in my pants pockets, and suddenly found myself being swiftly lifted upwards to collide with the ceiling, then fell to the ground at the same speed. At first, I thought the wardrobe behind me had fallen on me, and because of the dizziness, pitch darkness, and shock, I immediately got up and started screaming again to find myself tied to my bed by something invisible. I tried to scream but couldn't, as if something was closing my mouth, no echo of my voice. I burst into tears like a little boy, then felt an invisible crowd standing around me. I blinked to feel a slap on my face, which was light as a human slap. I blinked again to feel a stronger slap this time, then blinked the third time to receive a deafening slap to my ear, and the blood began to flow heavily from my nose. I tried to hold on as long as possible without blinking, but my patience ran out, so I blinked to find myself absent from existence. I don't know how long the coma lasted, but the first sound I heard was my mother crying, "Wake up, my son, don't break my heart." I woke up startled and gasped as if someone had rescued me from drowning. The morning sun had risen. I looked at myself and found my clothes stained with blood, thinking something bad had happened to me. My mother asked me if I had a fight with someone last night. I tried to reassure her and told her it's just the nosebleed as usual. Then she pointed to my face. "What happened to your face then?" I went to the bathroom brokenly and looked in the mirror to find my face swollen and turning blue. What happened to me? My God. I took off my upper clothes and was shocked by what I saw. Bruises covered my body, and I couldn't bear it, so I broke the mirror with my fist. There was no choice but to tell my mother what happened. We tried to call Sheikh Mohammed, but he didn't answer his phone. Then I called Joseph and told him what happened to me, so he told me that the jinn had started to take revenge on me and they wouldn't leave me alone until I suffered a mental breakdown. He advised me on some things I should do and told me to stay at home until Thursday, which is the day of my meeting with that man from the Thursdays. Thursday came, and I took a quick shower, then wore the jalaba, a loose-fitting, short-sleeved Moroccan garment. I had lost hearing in one of my ears since that fateful night. I sat waiting for them. The phone rang around 5 p.m. It was Joseph's number. He asked me to meet them at the neighborhood entrance, and when I went there, I was surprised by the luxury of the car driven by that man from the Thursdays. He was middle-aged, and his clothes indicated wealth. Joseph was sitting next to him. They got out of the car, and Joseph greeted me in his usual provocative way, "Welcome, our hero," and hugged me. Then I noticed there was a girl sitting in the back who didn't take her eyes off me for a moment. Her appearance was striking as she wore a black abaya and her eyes were surrounded by heavy kohl, and when that man noticed her gaze, he told me she's his daughter Sarah and that she insisted on coming with him because she loves visiting northern cities so much. He waved to her and she smiled. Then I offered them to go to my house, but the man asked me to wait for a moment. He went to the car and we remained. Joseph told me that my fate is in the hands of that man and that I should give him my absolute trust and fulfill all his requests. I didn't take my eyes off that man until he got out of the car and handed the keys to his daughter, then came to us. I asked Joseph about Sheikh Mohammed, so he told me he would come later after we agree on what to do. The man, whose name I never knew, arrived and told me, let's head to the house." I asked him, "Isn't your daughter coming with us?" He laughed strangely and told me she prefers to go for a drive in the car. We headed to the house, and when we reached the door and I intended to open it, I felt that man nailed in place. I looked at him inquiringly, so he told me, "It would be better if we go to the cafe." I insisted on entering, so he told me he couldn't. I felt an unusual sensation here because of his sudden change of mood, so I asked them to wait while I informed my mother. They told me they would wait for me at the neighborhood entrance where I met them. I entered the house and told my mother what happened, but she insisted on coming with me. I convinced her to stay because I have to meet them alone to understand how they will help me with my problem, and her presence with us wouldn't be appropriate. I left her murmuring prayers with me. I headed to the neighborhood entrance, and the two men were having a heartfelt conversation, and as soon as I approached them, I felt they changed the subject. I stopped and said to them, "What now?" The man from the Thursdays, whom I will now call the bald man because he was completely bald, told me that he called his daughter and that we have to wait for her arrival. Moments passed before the bald man's daughter arrived, driving at high speed. When she reached us, she slammed on the brakes nervously. The bald man looked at her reproachfully and said, "What did we say, Sarah?" She turned to me and said that it hadn't been a month since she had smashed her mother's Range Rover due to her recklessness while driving. I looked at them both in amazement. How does this charlatan possess such wealth? The girl got out and addressed Joseph with a strange cunning. "You sit next to my father and let me sit next to this handsome man." Her way of speaking embarrassed me, and I was surprised at how she spoke so freely in front of her father. We got into the car, and as soon as I sat next to her, she began staring at me again with those fixed gazes. I ignored her looks and turned my face to the road. My mother kept calling repeatedly, but I didn't want to talk to her in front of them. We reached the city center, and when we were about to sit in one of the cafes, the girl went to another table and took out a cigarette from her bag and lit it. This caught the attention of all the cafe goers because it's rare in our city to find a girl smoking in public. The bald man started talking to me, saying a lot of things, and the only thing I understood from his lengthy speech was "death awaits me." He pretended to be in danger while speaking to make a frightening impact, but I had long surpassed that stage and only wanted salvation at any cost. We engaged in conversation, and Joseph tried to intervene with religious talk. The bald man concluded his speech by saying, "Ashraf, there's nothing hidden anymore. If you want to be saved from all this, you must put 25 million centimes on the table." I repeated in astonishment, 25 million? I burst into laughter loudly. How could I come up with that amount? He replied that he would only take a 10% share of the required amount, and the rest would go to the generous ones. The first thought that came to my mind was that this guy was just a scam artist. I asked them to wait for me and went outside the cafe, trying to call Sheikh Mohamed again, but his phone was off again. I called my mother and asked her to come to where we were, explaining the situation. She said she was ready to sell the house to end this nightmare, but I wasn't entirely convinced and returned to them, telling them it was impossible for me to come up with that amount even if I sold one of my kidneys. I turned to Joseph, and he said, "We have only one solution left, and that is for you to give us the book." I almost agreed, then I realized the trap. How did the conversation suddenly switch from 25 million to the book? And I understood that the value of the book was much more than that amount. I reluctantly agreed to his request, and the bald man finally stood up and addressed us. "Let's go. The road ahead is still long." I didn't understand anything. "Road? Explain to me." The bald man said, "From now on, you are just an obedient servant, and if you want to be saved from your tragedy, you must keep your mouth, eyes, and ears wide open and fulfill every request asked of you. Then he told me coldly, nevertheless, if this experiment ends with your death, we are sorry, and if you survive, welcome to our world. I imagined that things were much simpler than this. Like sprinkling water on my body and giving me something to eat, then getting up safely. But the situation was much more complex than my naive expectations. They took me back home and asked me to wear white clothes and trim my nails. I spent about half an hour inside while my mother talked to them at the door. Then I went down the stairs, and I will never forget how my mother hugged me. And for the first time in my life, she said to me, "I love you, my son." I felt like someone about to have a noose placed around his neck. My mother kissed me and wiped my tears with her hands and put 1,000 dirhams in my hands without saying a word, then closed the door behind us. And with the first step on our way, I heard a loud scream from behind the door. I wanted to go back, but they stopped me. I felt it was the last time I would see my mother's face. I scanned the walls, alleys, and neighbors with silent looks until we reached the car, and I found a crowd of young boys around it. Poor things. It's rare for them to see a Volkswagen Touareg in front of them. I don't know where I'm headed. We left the city, and none of us spoke a word. I watched the road and the people. I asked Joseph if we were going to see Sheikh Mohammed. He replied that he would join us tomorrow at the place we were heading to. I asked him where we were going, and he said, "It's not important for you to know right now." I felt like I was being kidnapped. I began to watch the road signs to figure out where I was going, but even those signs stopped appearing after a while. Then the bald man started asking me. I don't know how it didn't occur to me earlier to ask him his name, about my story from the beginning, so I told him the whole story without hiding anything this time. And when I recounted to him what had happened to me with Baha'i, he told me strange things, including that I would meet them today, or they. I didn't understand anything he said. I was wary of his daughter Sarah because she was behaving unnaturally, and I felt her situation was worse than mine. After hours of traveling, we all felt hungry, so the bald man stopped the car in one of the towns on the road where there were various restaurants serving grilled meats like kofta and kebabs. I said to myself, this is the opportunity to ask someone about the place we're in, but Joseph didn't leave my side since we got out of the car, so I understood that they didn't want me to mingle with the people. We sat down, and when the waiter came and served the food, I quickly intervened, "Welcome to," and I paused. The waiter completed the sentence perfectly naturally, "Welcome to Toweret." They glared at me as if to say, "What a clever attempt." We finished our meal, and when I got up to pay, the bald man asked me, "Where are you going?" I replied, "To pay the bill." He said sternly, "Stay put, I'm not paying." I was surprised by his words. We left the restaurant, and the bald man greeted the waiter, then we left without paying the bill, which was undoubtedly around 400 dirhams. Here I knew that this bald man was a dangerous character, and I had to be cautious with him. We headed to the car, and we started chatting about everything. Suddenly, Sarah started raising the stakes between us and began asking me about my name and my educational level. She seemed nice, contrary to the impression she initially gave me. She was beautiful, but the way she put on makeup and her strange behavior ruined her beauty, and every time I asked her about her father or mother, she quickly changed the subject. We spent about an hour in the car, and every time I asked them, "What are we waiting for?" they would get angry and reply, "You need to be patient and stop chatting because everything we do here is for your sake." After a while, a large Mercedes 207 car arrived, and a strong-looking person got out of it. When he disembarked, he looked terrifyingly gigantic. His appearance suggested that he was just a rough peasant living his life between misery in the fields and sleep. The bald man approached him, accompanied by Joseph, and I followed them. When they saw me, they asked, "Is this him?" The bald man glared at me angrily, looked at my Nike sports shoes, which cost about 1,200 dirhams, then said harshly, "If you die, I'll take these shoes of yours." His words scared me, and I returned to the car. I asked Sarah about that person, and she told me she didn't know him at first, but after a moment, she said he was a friend of her father. The bald man and Joseph returned to the car, laughing. I began to feel that all this nonsense was just a charade, and I was the victim of it. The bald man started the car, and we followed the Mercedes driven by that rude man. The road was long and rugged, and fatigue began to overwhelm me. Then I fell into a deep sleep until I felt Joseph waking me up. "Get up, Ashraf, we've arrived." I got up quickly, and when I got out of the car, a biting cold hit my face, and there was no audible sound except the distant barking of dogs and the rustling of the trees surrounding everything. What brought us to this forest at this hour? At first, I thought we would travel to a sheikh or a Sufi shrine like the shrine of Buya Omar, but they brought me to this wilderness. I was determined to continue no matter what it cost me. Come on, we're late," Joseph said, as if he wanted to finish the matter quickly. I followed them until we entered a large hut in the middle of the forest. The scenes were harsh. More than 20 people lived in that hut in miserable conditions, barefoot dirty children, and men with faces ravaged by misery and need. I greeted them, but no one responded. The bald man and his daughter disappeared from my sight. I couldn't find a place to sit, and everyone was staring at me with curiosity and disgust. I wanted to leave the place, but an old lady yelled at me, "Go and join them over there," pointing to a small room. I took off my shoes and tried to enter the room. The door was creaky, so I pushed it open to be shocked by what I saw. The light was dim, and at first, all I saw was Sarah's hair cascading over her naked body, and the bald man on top of her. "What is this?" Then I heard Sarah gasp, and I hurried out, stumbling in my steps, and slammed the door shut, then went to search for Joseph, anger surging inside me. I was shouting, "Joseph! Joseph!" but there was no response. Then the old woman yelled again, "Get out of here, leave us alone." I didn't know what to do at that moment, and after a while, Joseph and that giant arrived, wondering, "What's going on? What's happening?" I asked Joseph angrily, "Is this the daughter of that beast, or who is she?" Joseph yelled at me, "This is none of our business. We came here for our own purposes, and then we'll leave. Don't ask again, you knew the terms of the agreement from the beginning." I found no way out but to continue. I said to Joseph angrily, "Come on, let's go for our purpose and finish this nonsense." The bald man came out to us calmly, smiling as if nothing had happened. He tried to hug me, but I pushed him away, so he said, "We know you, Ashraf, and we feel your suffering, and we want to help you, but you must be patient with us for a while and listen to what we have to say because everything we do is for your own good." I wanted to spit in his face at that moment. He led me into that room and started talking to me calmly. I found Sarah sitting there playing on her mobile phone, then she asked me to take a picture of her. I almost cursed that, then I restrained my anger, took out my phone from my pocket, and called my mother, finding her frightened and crying. She was praying, but she stopped her prayers when she heard the phone ringing. She said things I don't want to remember right now. I held back my tears so as not to appear weak in front of others, bid her farewell, promised to call her tomorrow, and hung up. Joseph rushed in on us, "Let's go and start our work," he said. I asked him, "What are we going to do?" He replied, frustrated, "Here we are starting again with idle chatter." I lowered my head and walked out. As I turned back, I found Sarah looking at me with caution, as if warning me not to go with them. Her look seemed to say, "Farewell, O doomed one." I glared at her with contempt in that moment. We stepped out into a terrifying scene. The young children looked terrified as they stared at us. It was the point of no return. We set off on our journey into the wilderness, amidst the biting cold and deep darkness. We approached a massive car and heard noise coming from inside. Then the rear doors opened. When I peered inside, I found a cage, but the darkness obscured the view, so I couldn't discern what was inside at first. I squinted and saw a large dog, but it seemed unnatural. It was larger than ordinary dogs. Joseph told me it was a wolf. The giant man climbed into the carriage, opened the cage, and unleashed the wolf, which was tethered with heavy chains and muzzle, yet it seemed extremely fierce, barely under control by the giant. The bald man ordered me to take out a box from his car. As I hesitated, I found a burlap sack and wanted to take it out as well, but I was discouraged from doing so. Then he took the sack in his hand, lit a portable lamp, and addressed us, "Let's go." Joseph turned to me and asked, "Are you ready?" I nodded, yes, and he said, "Let's go, with the grace of God." The bald man became furious and scolded Joseph, saying not to even think about repeating that word again. He started speaking in a language I couldn't even comprehend, filled with anger and menace. My curiosity pulled me towards knowing what was in that box that the bald man took out from his car. In a moment of distraction, I opened it slightly to find it filled with strange powder. What was this? I sniffed it and found it to be ashes. What could they possibly do with all this ash? I followed their steps into the depths of the forest, almost wetting myself with fear, yet I tried to encourage myself. I noticed every little detail along the way. We walked for about 2 hours. I was extremely tired, burdened by carrying the box and the roughness of the path. I asked them to stop for a rest, but the bald man calmly replied, "No need, we are nearing our destination." I wanted to check my phone to see the time, but it was off. Shortly after, they stopped walking and turned off the lights. The 3 men moved away from me and started a secret conversation. Then they returned, and the bald man ordered us to put down our loads and stop. The wolf lay down and started howling heavily, increasing my fear. What terrified me most was the thought of it breaking free and attacking me. The bald man started reciting some strange incantations loudly, while the wolf continued to howl. He seemed to know and memorize every word he uttered. At some point, silence engulfed the place, the bald man stopped, and the wolf ceased howling. Then the bald man approached me. I trembled in my heart, all my senses trembling. I could barely discern his features in the darkness. His eyes were wide, almost bulging out of their sockets, sweat pouring from his head, and foam surrounding his mouth. He passed by me, grabbed the box, and returned to his place. He opened it and began scattering its contents in the air, chanting other incantations. What shocked me the most was that the airborne ash didn't fall to the ground but seemed to be drawn into an invisible vortex. I looked around and found Joseph and the giant even more terrified than me. They seemed to fully understand the gravity of the situation. I felt a sense that these rituals were not for me at all, and that I was merely a sacrificial pawn in some demonic operation. At some point, the wolf curled up on itself, overcome by fear. The bald man turned to Joseph, saying, "He's here." Joseph approached him, asking, "Is it?" I couldn't remember the name, but it was long and strange. I looked at Joseph, who was on the verge of tears from the horror of the scene. My mind told me one thing at that moment: escape, you cursed one. At the same time, I felt something rush past me like lightning. The giant stood up and dragged the wolf along, holding a dagger in his hand, then handed it to the bald man, who was elated this time, and began shouting his strange incantations, reminiscent of the Russian language. He took the dagger and ordered me to stand up, yelling. I stood up as if paralyzed and walked 5 steps towards him, the longest steps I've ever taken in my life. I stood before him, and he embraced me, reciting his strange words, then released me and hurriedly went to the burlap sack, took something out of it, and placed it in my hand. Due to the darkness and fear, I didn't know what it was, but it appeared black, emitting the stench of a dead rat. I examined it quickly and screamed with all the strength I had. It was a human hand. At that moment, I thought of running with all my might and saving myself. The bald man picked up the hand from the ground and scolded me, placing it back in my hand and ordering me to comply with his orders. My legs were shaking from the horror of the situation. He then placed the dagger in my other hand and ordered me to stab the dagger into that hand. My hands trembled violently, and each time I plunged the cursed thing until I finally managed to sheath the dagger into the hand and pressed it with all my might. Then the bald man drew a circle on the ground with some powder and said to me, "Everything I tell you to do, you must do without hesitation or words." He instructed me to hold that hand in my left hand and write Surah Al-Fatiha backward in this circle. I told him I didn't know how. He took out a written paper from his pocket and said, "Transcribe from this paper." I followed his orders, feeling like I was doing something terrible. Imagine holding a human hand and writing a Quranic verse backward on the ground. I finished that horror and threw that hand away from me, my limbs trembling. Joseph and the giant came forward and began digging where I wrote Surah Al-Fatiha. The bald man disappeared into the depths of the darkness for moments. I sat near the wolf without caring this time. All human sensibilities within me were numbed. I looked at the wolf, and it seemed to say, "Who would have thought that the story that began with writing would end with sitting near this monster at this place in this hour?" I turned my face towards the excavation site and found the bald man had returned and began to assist his companions in the task. They were digging like a group of zombies. I bowed my head and closed my eyes until I heard their screams and wails. When I turned, I found them embracing each other like madmen, having pulled out a large box from the pit. Do you understand now what was happening? Well done, they found a treasure. I, who thought the whole treasure matter was just another nonsense, stood before them watching the scene. The thought crossed my mind to slaughter all these wretches and bury them in that pit. They set the box aside and began to eagerly clear the dirt from it. Then the bald man approached me, overwhelmed with joy, wanting to embrace me, but I pushed him away forcefully. He returned to the box, grabbed its lock, and ordered me to spit on it. I understood that the whole matter was in my hands and that I had the power to ruin it. So, I told him I wouldn't do anything until I understood what was happening here. The bald man began to shout angrily, "This is not the time for explanations. Do as I commanded you." I thought about fleeing. I looked around, but there was no escape amidst this wilderness. They could easily catch up to me and exact revenge in the worst way. I found no choice but to comply with their diabolical plan. He repeated his orders to me, "We don't have time. Come on." I held the lock in my hand, and what caught my attention was that it had no hole for opening. I spat on it twice and nothing happened. Then he ordered me to stop and step back. I recoiled and Joseph attempted to open the box, but the bald man forbade it. "Don't do it here." They gathered all their equipment and asked me to accompany them. "Where to?" Same answer, "Don't ask." The bald man and Joseph carried the treasure chest together, with the ash box on top, while the massive one carried the burlap sack on his back and dragged the wolf with his other hand. We walked for about half an hour until we reached a place I swear no human had tread before. We stopped there and Joseph strained to listen, then he bent down on the ground and removed a cover I hadn't noticed. He peered there and illuminated it with his lamp. I recognized it was a well. What was a well doing in this desolation? The wolf started howling again, and the massive man tried to calm him down. I approached and peeked into the well and quickly retreated. It was too deep. "Take off your clothes." I heard this sentence and didn't know who said it. I turned to the bald man. "Are you talking to me?" "Yes, I'm talking to you," said the bald man. I confronted him. "What do you mean by telling me to undress, you son of a?" Joseph wanted to speak, but I gestured him to shut up. The bald man tried to calm me, saying, "Look over there, you can't go down with your clothes." "Wait a moment, how do I descend there?" "Do you want to lower me into the well?" "That's insane. Are you out of your mind?" The bald man coldly told me that I had no other choice and that if I refused to do it, I would never see the light of existence again and would not enjoy the comfort of life, and I would have ruined everything for myself. What naivety paralyzes the mental faculties of a person when they find themselves in a situation beyond their comprehension, leaving them with no choice but to submit to any recipe, no matter how foolish and unreasonable, deluding themselves with the possibility of salvation. Will I not see my mother's face again? Will I not see my own face in the mirror again? I had never hugged my sister before, so why am I ending now? Will I not hear the laughter of my friends when I used to tell them jokes and pranks? Why is this my fate? I just want to see my mother again, kiss her hand, and apologize to her for every time my voice rose over hers, or for every time I oppressed her with my stubborn actions. I felt as if time had stopped while I stood in that remote spot in the world. What should I do now, my God? I turned and found that Joseph had brought a wooden ladder from somewhere. Then he addressed the bald man, saying, "Imagine that I forgot where I hid it. It seems they've been preparing for this for a while." I told the bald man that I wouldn't undress completely. He tried to persuade me, but my head was as stubborn as a goat's head, and finally, he said to me, "I've done what I had to, this is up to you." I took off my outer clothes, and the cold was bone-chilling. The bald man brought the burlap sack and placed it in front of me and called on the others to help him. God had granted that massive man muscles but deprived him of intellect. He left the wolf's reins and rushed towards the bald man. So, the bald man shouted at him, "Tie up that beast first, you idiot." The bald man returned to the wolf, but the latter hardly believed the news and rushed away from his captor. Despite the dire situation, I couldn't help but laugh at the sight. A massive beast fleeing from an even larger human. Imagine being naked while about to descend into a deep well, laughing hysterically at this scene. It felt like it was the last time I'd laugh in my life. The wolf struggled to break free from the chains wrapped around his neck, but our giant companion managed to catch him and tie him to the base of a tree. Then he returned to us panting. The lamp in the bald man's hand shone in my face, so I couldn't see what he took out of the sack. He approached me, and I found a black panther wrapped around his arm, holding its head with his fingers as if holding a sauce, with a deep laughter on his face. He looked at me, saying, "Isn't it beautiful? How does your merciful, loving God create something so beautiful and then implant evil inside it? Is this your compassionate, merciful God who loves his worshippers?" I wasn't in a position to start a religious debate, so I turned my face away from him, and he started chuckling. He took out that severed hand from the sack again, saying, "What's this doing here?" Then he threw it to the wolf and pulled a handful of teeth from his pocket, ordering me to put them in my mouth, saying, "Put them in your mouth, and don't you dare swallow any of them." I took the handful and found them to be human teeth. The first thing that came to my mind was that these teeth belonged to the owner of the hand itself. I placed them in my mouth and waited for instructions. He handed me the dagger and placed the panther's head in his right hand and its tail in his left, ordering me to split it from the middle. I hesitated and shook my head, refusing, so he shouted, "You have to slaughter it and drink its blood." Where am I going to find a lion here? Where am I going to find a crocodile? When I heard his mad words, I spat those things out of my mouth and sat on the ground, bursting into tears. I cried with the same hysteria that I had laughed with moments ago. Joseph came to me, trying to console me, and said a lot of things I couldn't hear. I was tired of hearing orders. I wanted nothing but to return to my mother, and the only solution left for me was to follow this path and survive or perish. I stood up, wiped my tears, and returned the teeth to my mouth, no longer caring whether they were human or dinosaur teeth, and held the dagger in my right hand. "Actually, in your left hand," the bald man addressed me. I split the panther from the middle without thinking and opened my mouth where the blood was flowing, and the bald man kept shouting, "Drink, drink," until the blood stopped, and I opened my eyes. The snake's blood had flooded my entire body. I looked and found Joseph and the giant gaping, their mouths astonished. They were amazed at this boy who hadn't finished yet. The bald man threw the remains of the panther into the well and made me kiss the ground, then put his hand on my head and began reciting some strange incantations while crying. Then he stopped me and ordered me to open my mouth and spit in it, and ordered me to spit those teeth into his hand. Then he threw them into the well. I turned to the well and listened, hoping to hear the sound of water, but I found nothing because of the depth of the well. Joseph and the giant put the ladder into the well, and Joseph addressed me. "Did you see the iron steps protruding from the well? You'll put your foot on one and hold on to the other." I asked him, "Will you pull me up quickly?" He didn't answer, and he lit the well with his lamp. With the first step I took on it, I felt that I wouldn't come out of this well again. Any person who thinks with their mind wouldn't do it, but I wasn't thinking at that moment, and I wasn't in my right mind. With each step I took down, I found their faces fading away. Was it because of the weight of the ladder or something else? I don't know. I finally reached the bottom, then the bald man called me from above, "Is everything all right down there?" I couldn't speak, I just nodded my head. They pulled the ladder, and I closed my eyes because I couldn't open them anymore. I heard them gathering their equipment, and then the noise faded and the footsteps receded. I started screaming, "Joseph! Joseph!" I screamed and cried and begged, but when I fell silent, I couldn't hear anything. They had gone far away. You who are reading this now, close your eyes and imagine yourself in my place. Couldn't you do it? I, in turn, couldn't. I couldn't bear it this time and kept screaming as if I had been bitten by a scorpion. I cried until my tears dried up, screamed until my throat almost split, wished for death but couldn't find it, wanted to kill myself but found nothing to help me with that. I lifted my head, seeing nothing but the stars in the sky. The echo of my screams was my only comfort in this solitude, along with the sound of the wind above and the sound of water below. I will never forget these moments. I wasn't crying out of fear, but because I would die alone without anyone knowing of my death, like any mosquito or fly that dies without anyone caring about its death. I wanted to leave the iron ladder and fall into the water, but I couldn't. I had given up all hope of survival. One idea kept recurring in my mind at that time, that the blood I drank was poisoned, and I sincerely prayed to God that it was so I could end quickly. I spent the rest of the night screaming, crying, and vomiting. I vomited as if I had eaten dirt. My intestines felt like they were coming out of my mouth, as if there was a mountain on my chest that I had pushed away. My voice hoarsed, the cold froze me, and the thirst burned me. I closed my eyes, and my mind inspired me to pray to God. As long as there was a well here with water, the shepherds would inevitably come out every morning. I remained in that state for hours, until a moment came when I heard a distant human voice busy with something. The voice began to approach gradually. It was a voice reciting the Quran, the recitation style resembling that heard in cemeteries. Can you imagine how I screamed then? I almost climbed the walls of the well. I screamed repeatedly, and tears of joy overflowed from my eyes. If I had heard a dog bark at that moment, I would have rejoiced. The recitation stopped, and the sound of footsteps approached. Then I heard the most beautiful voice in my life. Ashraf. At first, I couldn't make out the owner of the voice because of the sun's rays, and I only saw two heads pierced by those rays. The two persons were calling for me, but I no longer had the strength to answer. I just wanted them to get me out of there. They lowered the ladder, and I wanted to embrace it. I didn't remember anything until I found myself on dry land, with the two men standing at my head. The same hysterical laughter took hold of me again. Do you know the laughter of victory? I had triumphed over death, as if I had come out of my mother's womb again. The men hugged me, and I heard that beloved voice in my ear, Ashraf, my son, do you recognize me? The men spoke to me and tried to stabilize me. I saw the trees, felt the wind on my face, and contemplated their faces like a blind person seeing the light for the first time in his life. One of them held my shoulder, shaking it. I'm with you, my son, don't be afraid. I've come for you. I looked at his face for moments and then shouted, Muhammad. He hugged me tightly, tears streaming down his chest. I didn't want to leave him for a moment. I was afraid of everything, even myself. Within was a man of the most beautiful creation of God, his eyes glistening with tears. I had never seen him before in my life, yet without speaking a word, I hugged him as if I had known him for a long time. Sheikh Mohammed raised his head to the sky, praising God, and they held my hands, asking, Don't you have any injuries? Can you see well? What happened to you? I couldn't find the strength to speak. I just stared at them. They helped me put on my clothes, which were lying next to the well, but I couldn't find the shoe. That pig didn't spare me. The shoe didn't fit his huge foot anyway. The sheikh with Muhammad was called Yasin. He took off his traditional Moroccan slipper and put it on my foot. Poor me. At that moment, all I wanted was to drink water. What a strange world. To come out of a well thirsty. He asked me to be patient until we arrived. I leaned on them like crutches, and they never stopped reciting the Quran. We took a different path from the one I came from and quickly reached one of the villages outside the forest. Farmland surrounded the village from all sides, and at the entrance to the village, I knew it wasn't the same village where those cursed ones and I had eaten. I turned to Sheikh Mohammed and asked him, "Where are we?" He said, "Don't speak, my son." And when we reached the center of the village, we found a crowd of people waiting. Many eyes stared at me, and I heard nothing but murmurs. "They found him. They came. Is he the one?" All the talk was about me. The steps of Sheikh Mohammed and Sheikh Yasin quickened, with me leaning on them. I glanced behind me and saw the large crowd following us. Then we climbed a high and steep slope. I was exhausted and thirsty. We reached a mosque perched atop the hill. I entered with Sheikh Mohammed while Yasin stayed outside, holding back the crowds gathered around the mosque. Despite its simplicity, the mosque was beautiful, with its clean carpets. In one corner, Quranic boards were stacked. Mohammed sat me down on the floor and asked me to wait. Yasin entered and closed the mosque door, then sat near me. He rose and fetched a water jug, onto which I collapsed, desperately drinking. Yasin took it from my hand, warning, "You might get sick if you drink like this." Mohammed arrived with an elderly sheikh, well into his 80s. The old man's face came close to mine, scrutinizing its details. Meanwhile, Mohammed and Yasin were talking, and from what I understood, all the villagers had been searching for me and waiting for my arrival. I couldn't understand how people knew my story or how Sheikh Mohammed suddenly appeared and found me. I couldn't speak or ask questions. The only sentence that came out of my mouth was, "Give me the phone to call my mother." Mohammed hugged me and said, "Be patient, everything is in its time." The elderly sheikh turned to them, saying, "Shall we begin, by the grace of God?" I panicked. "I don't want anything else, leave me alone." Mohammed held my hands reassuringly, saying, "There's no need to fear, my son. I'm by your side, and with God's will, you will forget everything." They led me to a room with an open roof. There was a mortuary wash basin, and a shroud was placed on a stretcher. The old man addressed me, "This was meant for you, my son Ashraf, but now it's written for someone else." Mohammed said, "Listen, Ashraf, we need to circumcise you again." Surprised, I asked, "How?" "Just as you heard, my son." I placed my hands on my stones and exclaimed, "No, it's impossible. Are you crazy?" The scene was amusing. Mohammed sat me next to him and explained that circumcision would be symbolic this time. They made me sit on a plank, and Yasin entered with 2 water buckets. He said to me, "Take off your clothes so we can wash you." I did as requested. They washed me as they would wash the dead, then stood me up and wrapped towels around my body. Mohammed gave me a bag containing a new gown and underwear and asked me to wear them. The old man handed me a piece of musk and asked me to rub it on my body and behind my ear. Then Mohammed asked me about my condition, and I nodded that I was fine. He stopped me, and they all stood in front of me, then began reciting a congregational prayer, of which I only remembered in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. This weak servant. Because they were speaking quickly. When they finished, Yasin approached me with a smile, leaned into my ear, and started the call to prayer. I felt immense relief. Then Mohammed approached and asked me to recite the Shahada loudly. In that moment, I understood that I was becoming a Muslim and that everything was over. A new life awaited me. God had tested me greatly, and He's the forgiving, the merciful, the loving to His servants. I raised my finger, closed my eyes, and it was the most beautiful moment of my life, where I forgot everything I had been through. My tongue and my mind spoke together. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His servant and messenger. I opened my eyes, teary, and the first voice I heard was Muhammad's. "Welcome to the true religion, welcome to Islam." They greeted me, and we left the mosque, moving to a house adjacent to it. It was Sheikh Yassin's house. The house was beautiful in its simplicity, with its pristine white walls. We headed to one of the nicely furnished rooms. I asked the old man about the place we were in, and he told me to be patient, and I would know everything later. Muhammad entered behind us, holding a phone. "It's your mother." My son was the most affectionate voice I had ever heard in my life. We cried together, then I tried to reassure her that I was fine and that I would come soon. I couldn't bear to hear her cry like that, so I hung up. Sheikh Yassin told me, "Don't worry, those are tears of joy." Then breakfast came, and I indulged in the food as if I had never tasted blessings before. When we finished, Muhammad suggested that we go out to breathe some fresh air. As we walked, I asked, "Where are we?" He told me, "We're in an area near the countryside called Bab Broud." We were entoured, so how did we end up in Bab Broud? He said, "You need to rest now, it's not time for these questions." We returned to the village, and everyone we met on the way greeted us, hugged us, and the women sang. I spent a wonderful day with these simple, kind people. After dinner, Muhammad addressed me, "Get up, my son, let's go to the mosque, we want to talk to you." We headed to the mosque, closed its gate, lit a fire to ward off the cold, and sat in the middle of them. Muhammad looked at me and asked, "Are you okay now?" I replied, "Yes, thank God." Then he said, "Listen to what Sheikh Mukhtar will tell you." The old man spoke, "We know that you haven't yet overcome your bitter experience, but we need you to tell us everything that happened to you, from the beginning to the end." There was a moment of silence. I recalled all those bitter memories and began recounting from the moment I met the bald man at the entrance of the neighborhood to the moment they left me hanging in the well. When I finished, they looked at each other bewildered. Sheikh Yassin offered me to rest at his house, and I slept with those lids heavy that night until the sunlight kissed my face through one of the fenced windows. We had breakfast together, and I bid farewell to Sheikh Yassin and Sheikh Mukhtar. Then I and Sheikh Muhammad set off for my city. Sheikh Muhammad was a man of deep understanding and tried to explain things to me in a simple and gradual way. He initially made me understand that everything that happened to me was God's decree, and he assured me that I had no fault in it. He clarified his relationship with Yusuf, describing it as a superficial relationship through common friends who introduced them to our house for the first time. Muhammad told me that when they left our house, Yusuf was in a hurry and talked a lot on the phone, although Muhammad repeatedly tried to inquire about the issue of the man from Kemiset. Yusuf gave vague and general answers, promising him that everything would be fine. When they reached Tarudin, Muhammad couldn't find his phone, which he had placed in his handbag, and he couldn't understand how it got lost. The next day, he went to his sheikh friends who had accompanied him and asked for Yusuf's phone number to inquire about the details in the phone, but Yusuf didn't answer any calls. The only connection was between me and Yusuf. Muhammad told me that Yusuf, the bald man, and the big man were just charlatans, and the area we were in was famous for a legend that said there was a great treasure and things greater than the treasure, invaluable things. It's not gold or silver, but it's the buried, that's what Sheikh Muhammad said. He said that the bald man had tried to extract that buried treasure twice before, but it was unsuccessful. In the last attempt, a person who was with them was paralyzed. He was the son of the area where the needy family, whom we initially went to, resided. This explains the continuous screaming of that old woman in my face. The treasure was protected by the king of the forest Jinn, as Mo said, and no one could retrieve it unless specific qualifications and complex rituals were met. Unfortunately, those qualifications were available in my case. I tried to understand from Mo why exactly me, but he didn't fully understand the reason, and the conclusions he reached were based on analyses done by Sheikh Yassin and Sheikh Mukhtar in the mosque, and the practices I told them about were strange and unheard of to them before. Mo's words seemed inconsistent to me, which made me doubt his involvement in the matter. After pressing him to tell me everything he knew, he told me that Joseph's plans started on the eve of the day he was coming to our house with Al-Akhir. He had contacted Mo's common friends and told them that the only way to free me from jinn dependency is death. How? I must reach a stage where I wish for death without realizing it or even finding a means to commit suicide, and that was my situation in the well. Either I would survive free from jinn dependency but with sustained mental disability, or I would die as a polytheist. Summoning jinn is not as easy as some might think. They are not toys in the hands of humans whom they summon at their whim and dismiss as they wish. This summoning entails an implicit agreement that you become the ruler of the beings you summon from the other world, and in return, this being becomes your ruler, and absolute obedience is not only expected from it but also from you, for everything has its price. It's a dual dependency relationship, and nothing can distinguish between you afterward except death, which you must reach with complete conviction, and this was the prescription applied in my case. When Mo learned of Joseph's plan, he didn't have time to ask about what happened and how they took me with them, and the only thing he could do was to catch up with me as soon as possible. Joseph had previously specified to Mo's friends the exact area where I would be located and the exact point of the well where they would find me. Then he ended his statement coldly. "If you find him dead, you don't know me and I don't know you." Then he hung up. Mo was torn with confusion. He initially decided to back off and withdraw from the whole matter, especially since it involved death and he might face major troubles. However, he reconsidered his fear afterward and decided to catch up with us. Joseph wasn't answering his calls. Mo enlisted the help of the villagers near that forest, led by the mosque's scholar Sheikh Yassin and also Sheikh Mukhtar, and they searched about 70 wells without success. They started to lose hope of finding me, and they were about to give up their search until God sent a woodcutter from that forest to inform Mo that there was a well deep in the forest, known only to a few, and its water was used only by hunters during hunting seasons. And so they found me in that well between life and death. Mo and I talked a lot. I tried to understand the secret of the hand, teeth, and wolf rituals, but he himself didn't understand anything about them. And he told me that he wouldn't rest until he found those villains and knew everything from them. Finally, we arrived at my hometown, and I found my mother waiting for me. I couldn't wait for the bus to stop, so I jumped off and hugged her tightly, a hug of someone who doesn't want to part. I swore not to leave her again in my life or hers. I won't elaborate on the moments because they describe themselves automatically. And when the three of us arrived home, the first thing I intended to do was to burn that book, but Mo forbade me and told me that I would know the reason later. I left him to explain to my mother what happened, and we agreed not to tell her about the troubles that happened to me. Days passed, and I was slowly getting better. I became regular in psychotherapy sessions and Quranic healing sessions at the same time. My outlook on life had completely changed, and I became like an old man who had spent decades of his life. My mother, due to family circumstances, had to travel to my father, which forced me to sit alone at home. This was my first real test. The days passed slowly in their routine until one day while I was watching a movie to distract myself, suddenly, rewind that scene, and here another story will begin. "Do you know?" But he didn't leave and she returned. and her return this time was worse than the first. She swore to separate me from every beloved one because I wanted to part from her, and that's what happened. My parents, who spent over 30 years together in love and exile, got divorced. My mother became constantly ill and weak, and I still saw terrible things in my sleep and woke up to find my body bruised, battered, or bitten. But I swore not to give up. I returned to my studies again, and I will try to carve out my professional path and leave home. Here, I thank everyone who prayed for me in my ordeal. The end.